I'm Greg Schneering, and I have the opportunity and the honor of talking with and interviewing Ted Krichels today for the Track Media Oral History Legacy Interview Series. This interview today will tell the story of Ted's time at KBDI-TV, licensed to Broomfield, Colorado. And it's the first in a 3-act series that will talk about Ted's overall career in public broadcasting. In other interviews, I'll talk with Ted about his years at WPSU TV and FM at Penn State, and also the time that he spent at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in Washington, D.C. In addition to today's interview, Ted talked with 4 of his colleagues from KBDI-TV. As you watch this interview, you'll see excerpts from that conversation, as well as some clips from early KBDI-TV programming. As you'll hear during this interview, this relatively small public television station was ahead of its time through the workplace environment it fostered, the issues it covered, and the programming that it developed. Ted, welcome.
Welcome, and I'm very happy to be here. I think I'll tell you when we're done.
Well, Ted, why don't we just start with your personal journey, because you have a fascinating journey that I think probably influenced your professional career. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I think it's unique.
Well, sure. And let me just jump into it. It's hard to know where to start. I grew up in a large family in the Berkshires. There were six children. Our father died when we were fairly young. I was 14. So we were to some degree on our own after that point. Our mother had a hard time after her husband's death. So I didn't have a lot of direction. I went to a Catholic boarding school, all boys, which was an interesting experience. Then I went to an Ivy League college. This was during the 60s, and a lot of stuff was going on. Vietnam War, obviously, drugs, everything. And I originally, I think, was expected to be the lawyer in the family. But somehow, it might have been during my Russian literature phase. It didn't make sense to me that I would go to law school. And I was going to take the, what do they call it, PSAs, but I never did. Instead, I traveled around the country. I actually spent a couple of years. I went around the country 3 different times. In that process, especially around the 3rd trip, I was intentionally doing different kind of psychology, spiritual workshops, so Gestalt, Encounter. There was one in San Francisco. There was like 60-day Eureka Enlightenment training. So at the end of it, I was enlightened for about 2 hours. And then I went to Maine. I had family. A lot of us had gone up to Maine and bought some land. It was very cheap at that point in time. And I had made a commitment with a brother and a sister to build a house. So we met in Maine and built a house where I lived for a year or so. And it was a great experience, very different than all my spiritual and all of that. I was very kind of, if you've ever been in rural Maine, it is not exactly San Francisco, or it's not. It's a very, very different experience. So I was there, and then wanted to get back into some kind of spirituality, and had heard about Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, which was a new kind of Buddhist college, and particularly brought in a lot of Western psychologists. So there were summer sessions that were really kind of interesting sessions where you had different experts from around the country that would come there, and it would be mixed with Buddhist teachings. And I got very into Buddhism, moved to Boulder in, I think, about 1975, and I was involved in that community for about 5 years or so. It got fairly intensive, kind of culminating with a 3-month retreat in Dixville Notch, New Hampshire, which was meant to be the gateway into the full tantric teachings. But I think somewhere along the line, I was having some doubts, general doubts about organized religion, but also about the difference between being in kind of a discipline and being in a cult. And I think I was just getting uneasy with it. So that's when I was also, doing these jobs to support my habit, if you will. And they were menial jobs. I had one I remember was kind of throwing mail in Neodata. It was this big kind of mail warehouse where I was in the middle, and there were all these bags around, and you kind of throw to different zip codes, and it was kind of like basketball, you kind of throwing mail in the different bags. And so that was one. And then after the seminary I talked about, I was hired by a Buddhist to be a parts manager at an RV factory where they made, basically the bodies for the recreational vehicles, those really ugly things you see, driving around. And so I was in the middle of this big kind of warehouse floor and handing out parts. And I hurt my back. I had actually done it previously, building the house in Maine, but then it came back, and it was it required back surgery and fusing of the disc. And what that did was it qualified me for a bunch of state assistance, state and federal. So I was able to get, one, I got job counseling, which was kind of interesting. So I went through a lot of testing, and I aced all my tests because I'd been to a good college. And they were lining up these interviews for my career, and it was kind of a weird mix. I remember the interview at Ball Brothers, and they were setting one up at Famous Footwear, and I was not inspired.
So through all of that, deciding not to go to law school, through building the house, through traveling around the country, through Buddhism, what did you learn from that period that shaped your thinking later in life?
Well, I think one of the things I learned, I mentioned some about my early upbringing, boarding school, and somewhat privileged, I guess. We weren't that wealthy, but we grew up on 20 acres of land, and we had lots of animals, and all went to private schools. And it was kind of disconnected from the real world. So I think part of doing that was to kind of break through my patterns of just kind of, whether it's in direct feedback that you get in Gestalt or Encounter, or whether in spiritualism, kind of meditation. I did a lot of meditation, retreats all alone and group meditations. And I think there was a kind of a perspective that developed, a little bit of perhaps a distance from my own ego. That comes and goes, but that it did alter my general world view. And I think the challenge was to come back from that and say, what am I going to do with my life? I mean, do I want to be a monk? Which I think I did not. And then, what is it that would inspire me? So that was, I was in this kind of consulting, kind of being told where I could go for interviews and things. And I saw this ad in the local Daily Camera, the Boulder Daily Camera. And it was just a weird ad. It was Fremco, Front Range Educational Media Corporation, and it said like public media station, something like that, about to, going to go on the air, and was looking for a volunteer coordinator. And I'd organized some stuff in the Buddhist community, film events and things like that. And it was paid, half the salary would have been paid because of my injury by what's called a CETA program. So it just, public media has always intrigued me. I mean, I didn't have a TV. We didn't have a TV till I was 13, but, I remember watching Fire Line with my father, and I and remember building a house in Maine, listening to the Watergate hearings on public radio and watching them at night on NewsHour. So I had an affinity for it, and it kind of fit in with my general idealism at the time. So I knew absolutely nothing about Fremco, and I went to this interview. It was in this old building in Lafayette, Colorado. It was on the second floor. It's kind of basically in shambles, all this used furniture, old desks lying around. And, it was a group interview, and John Schwartz, who was the founder of Front Range, what became KVDI, and John is a very intense guy.
At the beginning, this was a very small effort. I mean, it was me in the basement typing out the application, recruiting the board of directors.
He identified one of the 2 remaining VHF channels in the country. KVDI became Channel 12. He got a construction permit, and he kind of did all this. He had some trust funds, so that was the funding to kind of initially get everything going. Most of the people that were there were, it was a combination of volunteers and about a handful of people that were paid minimum wage. And that was what I jumped into. And it's a volunteer. So my first project was, bizarrely enough, to organize an on-air TV auction. So here we are, a TV station that's not on the air with people who have never done TV before. The ones who know anything came out of radio, pretty much. And I'm there calling up potential volunteers for a television auction.
An auction for a TV station that's not even on the air yet. Before I forget about it, let me ask about the call letters. Did Schwartz come up with the call letters when he did the application? Because KBDI TV, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was definitely thought through in advance by some process that I had nothing to do with. We had a contest for the logo, and so everybody could submit it, and I was not part of the judging at that point. I was just the lowly volunteer coordinator. But there was this guy, it really did look like some creepy guy, peering around the corner and up to no good. So that was our logo.
We used to call it the flasher because he looked like a flasher. Oh, you found yours, Pam. Yay.
There's the flasher.
There it is. There it is.
You see that?
That logo was designed by Chaz Barber, who was a graphic designer in Boulder. And I also, you have Twilight Zone, our most popular show.
With this on the back.
That was what we looked like and what we started with. So all of this was premised on this kind of unreal notion that we were going to be on the air. But the other station, KRMA, had gotten wind of this. I think they were a little bit late, so they got wind of it as, when John got the construction permit. And they were freaked out. I mean, the idea of having a second public television station potentially competing with them for resources and, viewers, they were totally against, and they petitioned to keep KBDI off the air. And it was a pretty intense thing. And at that point, having the construction permit did not mean you could go on the air. But what happened was, and this is totally out of the blue, I don't think KBDI had anything to do with it. The FCC dropped that requirement. So it basically said you can go on the air with a construction permit. You still need to get the broadcast license eventually, but you can be on the air before that time.
When we first went on the air, people had to physically take the tapes up to Squaw Mountain so they could be aired. There was no, they didn't have a microwave dish or anything, to transmit the shows. So it was touch and go whether they would get there in time.
Yeah, this license was originally intended for the University of Colorado in Boulder. So, and the original studio was in Lafayette, right outside of Boulder. But once we could go on the air, we needed to have line of sight to our transmitter site, which was on Squaw Mountain. And for that, we had to move to Broomfield.
I mean, just even at the transmitter, oh my God, the stories. And I did save this, and I took it. I saved one of the meat thermometers. That's how we could gauge the heat at the transmitter up on Squaw Mountain, because we didn't have equipment to fully gauge. Everything would be okay if you're at beef, but if you hit poultry, then it was too hot and we couldn't operate the transmitter. So I have one of the 3 heat thermometers there that I will never let go of. It's actually got a prominent place where all of my family little heirlooms are in my China hutch, is this heat thermometer.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, poultry was bad news. And so
Oh, that's so funny.
The challenge was to get on the air, which we did. And even with doing all of that, we weren't at that point qualified for CPB funding. We weren't a member of PBS. So we basically had no funding outside of John Schwartz's trust fund. And he was very careful about how he spent that money. So it was a very kind of tight organization with very little funds. So at that point, well, our first thing we needed to do was to raise money, and the most obvious way to raise money is have a pledge drive. So I somehow, we hadn't really established clear lines of who's doing what, but I think I just started working on, what are we going to show? And I did that with another guy, Nick Fraser, who was one of the kind of key people at KBDI. I think he then went on to WLIW in Long Island. We basically put together a schedule. So Nick was working primarily with sources like Sika, now NITA, I think, and kind of getting a lot of these cooking shows and old shows that weren't part of the PBS, but they were public television offerings, just a lot older ones. And then I was looking at things from public domain and different films that I could get from Kit Parker or Budget. And I think John actually got the first TV show, which was Twilight Zone, which was kind of a big hit for us. And I got a bunch of others, Burns and Allen and Alfred Hitchcock and Have Gun Will Travel.
You must have had a mechanism kind of already in place from the auction to take the pledges.
Well, what we had in Broomfield was a big warehouse. So so one part of it was the studio, and so we built a phone bank, and so I mean, it's just basically building the stuff from scratch, and the phone bank isn't that big a deal, but and we scheduled a program, a pledge drive, and I'm trying to remember what we had in there, but we had some very weird programs, and Night of the Living Dead, we had Give Me Shelter, the Rolling Stones. I don't know if these really were public domain, but they seemed like they were at the time. I think things got a lot stricter when cable came in and all of this. And then we had local shows we had started. One was Off the Wall, and I think the special during the pledge drive was on transsexuals, and so we just had a whole bunch of things, and the phones were ringing. I mean, especially I think Night of the Living Dead and the Rolling Stones, they went crazy. We didn't realize it. We'd never done this before, so I don't think we realized that the fulfillment rate of people watching Mick Jagger at midnight might not be that great. We had a certain euphoria at the time that, hey, we're doing this. This is TV, and we're getting all this. We're getting these members and everything. And I think the reality of what we actually got in was a little bit more sobering.
Would you say that the first drive was a success, as well as the auction being a success?
Well, we never did an auction.
Oh, you didn't do the auction.
Oh, we never, it didn't make any sense. I mean,
Okay.
the effort, and as you know, I mean, probably at least on the TV side, auctions are not, yeah, they're very labor intensive. We did a few, we did some travel auctions and but they're not, they're not really good net revenue generators. And you don't have any viewing audience. So you're basically giving up your audience to do on-air sales. So no, but initially, no, we did not have the resources to really pull it off.
So you were euphoric from the first drive until reality hit?
Yeah, and it was my first, well, actually, no, my first on air, because the first thing we did when we went on air was to basically bash KRMA. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean, that's what we basically, because we needed to use our air to stay on the air. So we had spots, and I think the first TV spot I ever cut was, KRMA is trying to keep us off the air. If you think they should stop that, call them up, tell them. But we think there is a place for us in this community, and we need your support. So we had a bunch of different spots. Mine was one of a number of them, and we just ran those quite a bit.
You're on the air. You've had the first pledge drive. But what was KBDI TV modeled after? Was it modeled after another television station?
No, it was modeled after radio, and specifically, I've mentioned Jeremy Landsman.
So yeah, we were born out of the idea of let's do something unique, different, interesting, and maybe at times wild.
The engineer who pretty much built the station, but he had built stations, radio stations around the country. I think KRA Crab Radio in Seattle, KDNA in St. Louis, KFAT in California. I think he was even involved in the one in Madison, WORT, initially. He was close with one of the patron saints of alternative radio, Lorenzo Milam, who wrote what's famous within the alternative radio universe, Sex and Broadcasting. And I remember visiting KBDI. And so the idea was to have a public television station that kind of was inspired by that spirit of independent radio, alternative radio, to have voices of the community, to be very community focused, to have kind of alternative fare. But the reality of actually running a TV station, nobody really had a clue about. So it doesn't, and you would know, having been in radio and somewhat exposed to TV, there are some similarities, but very different. I mean, just the cost of the transmission and the cost of the infrastructure for TV is a lot more expensive than for radio, and the content, and you're reaching, we had a signal that, reached wide, throughout, it had a lot of different places where it, patches where it didn't get in, but it still reached up to Wyoming and, kind of way out in the plains. John actually had to resign for us to get on the air because part of KRMA's argument was John was unfit to be manager, because when he was in Pittsburgh Public Radio, I think maybe WYEP,
It was, yes.
they had, it wasn't self-serving at all by John, but salaries were donated back to the station and then used as matching, used as non-federal financial. So you had federal dollars coming in here and then essentially being laundered to be used to match to raise up their non-federal financial support to increase their CPB grant. I think that's essentially the gist of it. And I don't think it was done with any nefarious goals in mind, but it was not appropriate, not good. And So that was one of the key arguments that KRMA was making to keep KBD off the air, that John Schwartz was unfit to be the president of this corporation. So John resigned and Jeremy became president. And Jeremy has a lot of strengths, but management was not one of them.
What was the social and political climate like within the station?
Within the station, when you say the social political climate, like who was attracted to it, who came to it, because it was like it was highly attractive to certain people, sometimes for the good reasons, sometimes not. So you had, certain production types who I think wanted to be rock and roll producers. So we're really into kind of covering, I think we did Telluride Bluegrass and, all of this kind of from some really bad and whatever. So they had their motivations, which were a little more selfish. You had the idealists who were just volunteering time because they believed in kind of the 60s energy of that mainstream media was essentially kind of corrupt.
Exuberant. It was just like on fire feeling to me. And people were just so excited and so, it was crazy. There were a lot of crazy people and there were a lot of drugs and too much smoking of cigarettes and things like that, because I cared a lot about that. But the thing that was so astounding is I had applied to go to USC film school right around that time, like a year or two later. And I got in and I didn't go because I was having so much fun at Channel 12. And I'm thinking, I really got so much more of an educational experience in terms of, it was so great the way it was set up with different, I don't know how long this went on for, but all the volunteers got training from people who are specialists in their area. So we'd have a sound person come and do a workshop, an editing person, a camera, a lighting, a studio lighting, a field lighting, how to do interviews. It was amazing. I learned so much and I got to try everything because nobody really knew what they were doing. So it's like the world was out there for you and no one was saying, oh no, you can't do that. You don't know how to do that. No one ever said that to me.
It was just a fascinating place to work with colleagues that really challenge you, to have this open palette of what and who you wanted to be in the community as far as content.
When I moved to Colorado, I moved to Boulder, and I was trying to find some way to get into doing media again. And it took a while, but finally found KBDI was in Broomfield. It felt like home to me, first place I felt in Colorado where I felt like I fit in somehow.
I think the overall sense was of that kind of commitment to doing something different. But within that, you had a lot of different agendas that were going on. So it was a difficult place, as I got higher up in the management part, it was a difficult culture to kind of manage. Very creative in some ways, a lot of entrepreneurial, a lot of people willing to kind of do things, but not a what's the word? Dysfunctional, but not overall. I think I appreciate it in hindsight.
Somewhere along the line, Ted, I found a clip that appeared in the Boston Globe, and it read, "The first year was bizarre. At station breaks, announcers would say, 'Hey man, this is KBDI Broomfield.'"
Yes, indeed, folks, and we're grooving with FM TV right here on KBDI Channel 12, Barefoot Television for the Front Range. And a very good morning to you.
Microphones died, reels of tape fell out of machines, programs were inexplicably canceled. The Marx Brothers couldn't have done it any better.
In the Boston Globe, we had a lot of articles that were written in the early days. They got more positive, and even that one is, it's kind of it was sort of a fascination with KBDI, what are they doing? And, I remember coming in one day and, we're running Have Gun Will Travel and the film was upside down.
How much is the whiskey?
Well,
$5.
anybody watching, they've got to be either standing on their head or they think they're on the wrong drug or something.